In this lecture, I want to talk about the big story of the Bible, the overarching story of the Bible. Many people relate to the Bible as a series of isolated chapters or verses or stories, which in and of themselves are good stories and good verses. But they fail to realize that all of these stories and verses are part of a much larger, overarching story that is being told in the Bible. And in a nutshell, the story of the Bible is actually the story of God's kingdom coming to earth. That's what the Bible is about. How God's kingdom comes to earth and how somebody can be a citizen of God's kingdom and be a part of that kingdom. You may remember that one of the most famous prayers prayed in the Bible is the Lord's Prayer. It's a prayer where Jesus was teaching us how to pray and the things we ought to pray about. And in that prayer, Jesus says, "May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." You see, Jesus desired to see God's kingdom come to earth, and he wanted us to pray for that. We want to see God's kingdom here. And how would we know when God's kingdom was fully manifested on earth? He says, you'll know because God's will then be done on earth the way it is now done in heaven. So the Bible tells a story about how God's kingdom is going to come to earth. And one of the things you soon begin to realize as you read the Bible is that God's kingdom does not come instantaneously. It does not come all at once. Instead, God introduces his kingdom into the world step by step, by degrees, by stages. And the reason that God does this is that he wants to show us various aspects or characteristics of his kingdom. And by isolating one particular aspect or characteristic of his kingdom, you can see and appreciate it a little bit more. So he doesn't show us the whole kingdom at once. He introduces different aspects at different times in human history. Now actually, when the story of the Bible begins, God creates the first couple, Adam and Eve, and they soon began to have children, and these children populate and they fill the earth. But there is no kingdom at that time in operation. So we start out without any presence of God's kingdom on earth. And what is it like when we see no signs of God's kingdom on earth? Well, what we learn is that the people are extremely wicked and evil, and there is crime. And the reason for that is that all people come into this world as sinners who are not in fellowship with God. They love their sin, and they don't want to do what is right with their lives. And they may think of themselves as being good people, but they fall far short of God's standards. And they need God to give them a new heart, a new identity, to make them a new person on the inside and write his law on their hearts. So the problem is you had a world full of these people who have not been saved, and God hadn't given them new hearts. And so the world was a very wicked place. And after hundreds and hundreds of years of this, God finally had to step in and bring it all to an end. And he did this with the flood in the days of Noah. This is the story of Noah and the ark, where God just wipes everybody out and says it's so bad, it's so wicked. So if you want to know what the world would look like without God's kingdom here, that's what it looks like. And see, that's what God was showing us. God is showing us in the opening chapters of the Bible, Genesis 1 through 11, what the world looks like when God's kingdom is not on earth. Now this period of no kingdom existing lasts for about 2,000 years, generally speaking, about 2,000 years. After the flood of Noah, two things happened. First of all, they began to repopulate the world again. It began to fill with people, and they spread around the globe. The second thing that happened is God instituted government. God delegated to human beings the institution of government to rule and reign among the nations of the world. And the government would establish a system of justice that would put a restraint on the wickedness of men. It would put a restraint on people committing crimes against others, to keep them from committing murder and stealing and raping other people. And so God gives this authority to government. Well then, once the world has repopulated, you've got all these different nations now with these different governments. Beginning in Genesis chapter 12, God singles out one man named Abraham. And God says, Abraham, I've got plans for you. I'm going to cause you to have many descendants in the years ahead. The descendants will multiply until there are thousands and thousands, yea, millions of them. And you'll be numerous enough to form a nation of your own, the Jewish nation, the Jewish people. And so your descendants will take their place among the nations of the earth as a sovereign nation. And like all these other nations that now have government to help restrain the wickedness of men in the world, this nation is also going to have a government, but it will be different than all the other governments of the world. Because I myself will write the constitution for the nation. I will write the laws. And so this one nation will become the representative of my kingdom on earth. So the Jewish nation, the nation of Israel, represents God's kingdom on earth. And you think, well, this is great, because here is a nation where the laws are written by God. And if God is the one making the laws, well, they've got to be good laws. Well, you can't have a better nation than that when it's God himself who writes the Constitution and God himself giving you the laws. And so this nation exists in place there in the land of Israel. And what God does, starting with Abraham and his descendants, goes on for about 2,000 years. And this really is the story of the rest of the Old Testament. Once we get to Genesis 12, we're into Abraham, and the entire rest of the Old Testament is taken up with the story of this one nation and how they represented God's kingdom on earth. And as you read through the story of the Old Testament, you learn that even though it sounds so good on paper, it didn't really work out so well in the real world. Why? Because the people running this nation, the people leading the government of this country, and the citizens of the country, again, were people who were unsaved. They had not been born again. God had not given them new hearts. See, one of the things that God does when he saves a person is he writes his law on their heart. Well, if a person has been saved, God's law isn't written in his heart. So you have good laws written on the books, but the law of God isn't written on the hearts of the people. So the people leading the nation were corrupt, and they were wicked, and they weren't following the laws, and they weren't doing the right things. And the citizens of the kingdom, they weren't following the laws, and they weren't doing the right things. And so it was a nation with good laws, but God's will wasn't being done on earth because nobody was actually doing that stuff. Well, after some 2,000 years of this, finally Jesus Christ comes on the scene. Jesus comes on the scene, and when he comes into the world, Jesus switches things up. He changes things. He says, now we're going to switch the kingdom of God, which is my kingdom, and we're going to switch it from being a kingdom that is based in a single country with a national government. We're going to switch it from being, therefore, a visible, physical, institutional kingdom into a spiritual kingdom. As a spiritual kingdom, anybody can be a citizen of the kingdom. You don't have to be a Jew, so you can be any ethnicity. You can live anywhere around the world. You don't have to live in one particular country. It doesn't matter what government you live under, because this kingdom now is not tied to any particular government or country or ethnicity. This is a spiritual kingdom, and all who put their faith in me and all who are born again will be citizens of this spiritual kingdom. So now we see a different aspect of God's kingdom. And this is the kingdom that we now refer to as the church. The church is this spiritual kingdom. And most of the New Testament is taken up with describing the nature and the mission of the church as a spiritual kingdom. So in the Old Testament, we saw what God's kingdom looked like if it were just a physical kingdom rooted in a government. Now in the New Testament, we see what God's kingdom looks like if it's just a spiritual kingdom consisting only of people who have been born again. And when we look at the church, we say, well, this is certainly an improvement over what we saw in the Old Testament, because here all the citizens, all the members of the kingdom in the church are people who have been born again. So God's law was written on their hearts. They love the Lord. They're in fellowship with God, and they want to do the right things with their life. And so that's definitely an improvement. But guess what? This is not the full manifestation of God's kingdom on earth. And you know it because God's will is still not being done on earth as it is in heaven. You know why? Well, because it is only a spiritual kingdom, that means the church is not running the governments of the world. See, it's not the job of the church to run the government. It's not the job of the church to run the country. See, God ordained human governments and gave them a certain role to fill in society, and He also established the church, and He gave it a different role to fill. So the church is not the government is not the church. The two are separate and distinct, and they had different roles. And it is not the job of the church to be trying to run the government. It is not the calling and the job of the church to run the country and to try to make people do right. No, the church is a spiritual kingdom. Now, there have been times in history when people in the church misunderstood this. If somebody didn't do right, if they didn't believe the right things, they might burn them at the stake. Well, the church shouldn't have been doing that because the church is a spiritual kingdom. It's not our job to try to make people outside of our spiritual kingdom who aren't citizens of our kingdom. It's not our job to try to make them do right. It's not our job to burn them at the stake. Membership in the spiritual kingdom is voluntary. If you are a believer in Jesus, you want to come to Jesus, you've become a citizen of His kingdom. And if you don't, that's your choice. It's not the job of the church to try to force people to do that. So it is a spiritual kingdom, and you can see why it's important to understand the broader story of the Bible. You see, that helps you understand the nature of the church, right? And the role and the mission of the church, that we're not here to run the government. We're not here to try to make everybody out there do the right thing, right? But the downside of that is that God's will still isn't being done on earth. Now, the church has been around for about 2,000 years, and we don't know how much longer it will exist in the world, but many people think that we are probably in the end times, which means that the role of the church as a spiritual kingdom is probably about the end. The next thing that should be happening in the future is that Jesus is going to come again into the world. He's going to come back to this world. And when He comes again, He is going to switch things up again, just as He did the first time He came. When He comes again into the world, He's going to switch things up a bit in the way that the kingdom works. When He comes, He's going to base His kingdom in Jerusalem, over in the land of Israel, and it will be a global kingdom. He will rule the entire world from His capital city of Jerusalem. He will rule the entire world. This will be, again, a return to a kingdom that is, it's a visible, physical, institutional thing. It's a government. It will be the government run by Jesus. Once again, the world will be operating under laws and rules written by King Jesus. He's the one that will be in charge. Not only so, but the Jewish people will help Him administer and run His kingdom over all these different nations of the world. But at that time, all of the Jewish people will be believers in Jesus. They will all be people who have been born again and to whom God has given new hearts, and His law will be written on their hearts. And so they'll be good people. And so to be a very different situation than we saw in the Old Testament era. In the Old Testament era, the Jewish people were supposed to represent God's kingdom on earth, but they didn't have new hearts, and so they were wicked and corrupt. But when Jesus comes again, they'll all be saved people, and God's law will be on their hearts, and they'll be helping him lead this kingdom, and then there will be no corruption or wickedness among them. They'll be leading it properly and correctly. And in addition to having Jesus himself here ruling the world, and good people helping him lead this kingdom, Jesus is going to do a lot of other good stuff in the world. For example, he's going to roll back some of the effects of the curse that Adam and Eve introduced to this world. So, for example, there will likely no longer be things like earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes in the world. Isaiah chapter 11 says that the animals will no longer be meat eaters. So animals won't attack and kill one another. Instead, he said, ferocious beasts like lions will return to just eating grass and straw. All animals will just eat grass and straw. He says the lion will lie down with the lamb. And so we're going to see nature back to the way that God originally intended it to be in many respects. People won't get as sick. In fact, lifespans will be dramatically longer. Right now, if a person were to live to be 100 years old, we'd consider him lucky. But when Jesus comes again and sets up this kingdom, it's going to last for 1,000 years. The book of Revelation, the last book in the New Testament, is the book that really elaborates on this kingdom that Jesus is going to set up and tells us it will last for 1,000 years. But from some prophets in the Old Testament, again, like the prophet Isaiah, we learn that most people will live for the entire 1,000 years because they won't be dying very young. Also, there won't be any wars between nations because Jesus is going to put an end to war. There'll be no war. So it'll be a wonderful environment. King Jesus ruling, his laws in place, good people helping him lead the government, and the earth almost a virtual paradise, a place of peace and prosperity. What could go wrong, you would think? But here's the problem. While God's law will be written in the hearts of some of the citizens of that kingdom, not all of the people in that kingdom will be true believers in Jesus, will have been saved and born again. And so, although the government of Jesus will make them do the right things outwardly, in their hearts they are going to resent the holiness that Jesus is forcing upon the world. Oh, they're happy with the peace and the prosperity aspect of things, but the downside for them is that Jesus won't let them have their sin. They can't go out on the weekends and party and get drunk and do drugs. They can't run around and commit adultery and fornication. See, they can't do that kind of stuff anymore because King Jesus isn't going to let them do that. But that's the stuff they want to be doing on their weekends. And so in their hearts, they are going to resent King Jesus and his kingdom. Despite all the prosperity and the peace, they will resent King Jesus because he won't let them live out their sin. And so at the end of 1,000 years, all of these people who have never been born again are going to join together and mount a rebellion against Jesus and his kingdom, and are going to try to overthrow his kingdom and take charge of the world. Now, it won't succeed. The Bible tells us that Jesus will put down the rebellion immediately and put an end to it. But what do we learn from this? Well, we learn that man's biggest problem is not really his environment. It's not really society. Boy, if we could just put him in the right environment, if we could just get the right kind of laws and set up society where it operates just the right way, why everybody'd be good and everything would work out. Well, no, because you're going to have a perfect society and still people won't do right. You know why? Because man's biggest problem, according to the Bible, is not his environment. It's not society. It's not what laws we have or don't have on the books. It's not what politician is leading the country. It's not what party has control of the White House. You know what man's biggest problem is? His own heart. Our biggest problem is our heart. And unless we come to Jesus, asking him to make us new people and give us new hearts and write his law on our hearts, then people are not going to do the right thing. Well, after the 1,000 years, Jesus is going to, as we've said, put down this rebellion and then remove from the world all of these people who have never been born again. So you're left only with people who have been born again, who have God's law written on their hearts and not just on the books. And then he's going to redo the earth. He's going to make a whole brand new earth. Whole brand new earth that's going to be perfect. It's going to be a paradise. And he is going to rule and reign. And the only people who will be allowed to be there and be a part of that kingdom and participate in this wonderful paradise earth will be people who have been born again. People in whom God has written his law on their hearts. People who allow Jesus to give them new hearts. Jesus told Nicodemus in John chapter 3, unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. You're not going to be there in that paradise earth if you've not been born again. Not going to let you be there. Now somebody said, well, God's a loving God. Why doesn't God let everybody be there in that new earth? Why doesn't God let everybody participate? Why does he just send some people to hell? Well, now you know why. The story of history, the story of the Bible shows you why. Because if God allows people to be a part of his kingdom who have never been born again, if he allows citizens to be in his kingdom who don't have new hearts, who've never allowed Jesus to give them a new identity on the inside, they're just going to ruin everything. God's will won't be done on earth as it is in heaven because they're always going to resent his will and work against his will. This is the story. You look back at the story. We start out about the first 2,000 years of human history. Right? God's kingdom wasn't present at all. And it was so bad, it was so wicked, God had to destroy the whole thing with a flood. Then we go the next 2,000 years, the rest of the Old Testament, and we've got a physical kingdom representing God's kingdom on earth, the Jewish nation, where the laws were written by God. It sounds so good, but the people running the kingdom were wicked and corrupt, and so God's will wasn't being done on earth. It wasn't really a very good place to live. Then Jesus comes into the world and switches it up and says, I'm going to make a spiritual kingdom. The only people that are citizens of this kingdom are people who have been born again, and it's a spiritual kingdom. There is no government, physical, visible institution. It's just a spiritual kingdom. Well, that's an improvement, but because it is a spiritual kingdom, that means we don't run the world, and so there's still a lot of wickedness going on. So Jesus comes back into the world again and combines the physical and the spiritual and says, not only will we have good laws, we'll have good people running the government. So there won't be politicians that are corrupt and all of that. It'll be a good government. Yeah, but still, some of the citizens of the government, some of the citizens there haven't been born again, and they resent and they rebel. I mean, it's almost a perfect paradise, and they still want to fight against it. They want to overthrow Jesus and ruin the whole thing. And this is why then Jesus has to remove from the world all the people who have never been born again. And so this is how God's kingdom comes to earth. And the story of the Bible is showing us why you have to be born again if you want to be a part of that kingdom. Because if God doesn't give you a new heart, you're going to ruin it. Because your problem isn't with your society or your environment or your circumstances. The problem is your own heart. And Jesus says, you need to let me give you a new heart. That in a nutshell is the big story of the Bible. Okay, now let's back up and introduce some of the key characters and events from the Old Testament that make up a part of and contribute to this larger overarching story of the Bible, and we'll put these characters and events in their proper chronological sequence. Now, naturally, the appropriate place to begin is with creation itself, and in particular the origins of mankind, Adam and Eve. According to biblical chronology, Adam and Eve would have been created by God and placed in the Garden of Eden about 4,113 years before Christ. And as an aside, we should be reminded that the expression BC stands for before Christ, meaning how many years before Christ was born something happened. And that stands opposed to the expression AD, which stands for the Latin expression Anno Domini, which literally means in the year of our Lord. and is a reference to how many years after the birth of Christ something happened. Now, people who are not Christians or who do not believe in Jesus sometimes use alternate expressions when writing dates. In place of the expression BC, they will use the expression BCE, which stands for before the Common Era. And instead of AD, they will use the expression CE, which stands for the Common Era. But at any rate, according to the Bible, Adam and Eve then come around a little more than 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. Now, when we read the biblical genealogies and the records of how far back it was when they were created, we know that it was a minimum of 4,000 years. But sometimes in the Bible, when a genealogical record is given, they'll skip a generation. Rather than going from father to son, they, for example, might go from father to grandson or father to great-grandson, and so skip one or two generations. And because of that, it's possible that actually Adam and Eve were created a little more than 4,000 years before the time of Christ. Maybe an extra 1,000 or 2 years we could throw in there. So maybe somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 years, depending on whether or not we think that there might have been some gaps in the genealogies. But we'll use the number of 4,113 BC. That is the minimum number of years before the birth of Christ that they would have been created. And you probably recall the basic story that they were put in the Garden of Eden and told not to eat of the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but in direct disobedience to God, they did that. And as a consequence, 4 things happened. First of all, they lost fellowship with God. And God is a holy God who cannot tolerate sin, and they sinned, and fellowship between God and mankind was broken. Secondly, as a consequence of their sins, their very nature, their very human nature and their makeup was corrupted such that they became sinners. They became people who by their very nature could no longer just always do the right thing or for the right reasons and the right motives. So they are fallen, broken human beings. Number 3, they would eventually die one day. And number 4, all of their children, all of their descendants would inherit their sinful nature, this propensity to sin, this inability just always to do the right thing. And they would also inherit the fact that they would someday die as well. So all of the human race is affected by the sin of Adam and Eve, a little more than 4,000 years before the time of Christ. The next major event that happens in the Old Testament record is the story of Noah and the flood. You remember that mankind was so wicked that God said, I'm just going to have to destroy everybody but Noah and his family and start afresh with them. So God wipes out the whole world with a flood and saves Noah's family by the ark. Well, this would have happened nearly 1,600 years after the time of Adam and Eve, in the year 2457 BC. About 100 years after the flood with Noah, the world had begun to repopulate a good amount very quickly. And this then is when we get the story of the Tower of Babel. This is an account where the people in the world at this time all speak the same language, but already they are showing again their sinful tendencies, their tendency to rebel against God. So they all unite together and decide that they're going to build a tower that's so tall that it could reach up into the sky, where they believe the gods or God himself lived. And so they could get up to the realm of the gods and be like gods themselves. Of course, God doesn't just live in the sky. He lives way beyond the limits of our universe. So it was a foolish concept, but it represented their pride. And so God interrupted their plans to all unite together in rebellion against them. And the way he did this is he caused them all suddenly to begin speaking different languages. Up to that point in human history, everybody spoke the same language. But now they're speaking different languages and nobody can understand one another. And so these different families and clans and tribes began to wander off in different directions around the globe. So they're no longer united in one place. They forget about trying to build the tower. And as they spread around the globe, they end up in different areas around the world, and they are now speaking these different languages. And as they begin to get isolated in different parts of the world, in that area, they all remarry within their clans. They're not marrying people from halfway across the world. And so as they get in these different pockets of population, different racial characteristics begin to get reinforced. And so as a result of the Tower of Babel, you get two main things happening. First of all, you get all these different languages around the world now being spoken. And secondly, you begin to get the different racial characteristics getting pronounced. For example, Asian peoples, or black peoples, or Caucasians. Now, originally, Adam and Eve, based on what we know of modern genetics, Adam and Eve probably would have had a light brown skin. They would have been neither white nor black, but somewhere in the middle with the genetic capacity to swing either direction a little bit. So some of their descendants, if they picked up more of the light skin gene, well, that would begin to be reinforced, and that's where you would get white people from. Those that picked up some of the genes that would emphasize more dark-colored skin, as that began to get reinforced, this is where you would end up with a lot of the black peoples. And so this is how we begin to get the different variations in the different racial characteristics. Some swinging to very white, some swinging to very dark and black. Adam and Eve would have been right in the middle with some kind of a brown skin. So, Tower of Babel, very important event because it's where we get the different languages, and the different racial characteristics then begin to get emphasized in the genetics. All of these events are recorded in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. When we get into Genesis chapter 12, Abraham comes on the scene. He was born in the year 2165 BC. And when Abraham is 75 years old, God appears to him and says, Abraham, I've got plans for you. I'm going to give you a descendant, and from him there will be many descendants. Thou multiply, eventually become the nation that is the Jewish nation. And we talked earlier about how God would single out this one nation and use this nation, the government of this nation, to represent his kingdom on earth. Well, this all starts with Abraham, as we said, who was born in the year 2165 BC. Now, God made this promise that Abraham would have a son when he was 75 years old, but at that point neither he nor his wife had any children. His wife had been barren. His wife was 65 and he was 75. 25 years passes before God finally gives them a son, meaning Abraham was 100 years old and his wife Sarah was 90 years old when they had that son, whom they named Isaac. Well, they were both well beyond the age of being able to have children naturally, but God worked a miracle. So Isaac was a miracle child. When Isaac grows up and gets married, he has a son named Jacob. So Jacob would be Abraham's grandson. Now, eventually, God appears to Jacob and changes his name to Israel. And this then will become the name of the nation that will develop from Abraham's descendants. The Jewish people and their nation will be called the nation of Israel. And they get that name from Jacob, whom God changes his name to. So you've got these three men, Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob. Those three men are the fathers or founders of the Jewish nation, and therefore they are often referred to as the patriarchs of the Jewish nation. Patriarch. Patriarch is simply a word that means the leaders, the male heads or leaders or the founders of a nation. Well, they are the founders of the Jewish nation. So the period of 2165 to 1805 BC is called the patriarchal period because it's the period when these three men lived. The period before that in history is often referred to as the pre-patriarchal era. Well, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, has 12 sons. And as those 12 sons have children and they begin to have a lot of descendants, well, they become the founders of different clans or family lines in this developing nation that are called tribes. So each of the descendants of Jacob's 12 sons are called tribes. And so as the nation would develop, they would come to speak of the 12 tribes of Israel, meaning hey, these particular people were a descendant of this son of Jacob, or these people in the nation are descendants of a different son of Jacob. The most important of his 12 sons was a son named Judah, because Jesus Christ himself would eventually be a descendant from the tribe of Judah. Now, eventually Jacob and his 12 sons move into the land of Egypt. And there they end up staying, and it's there that Jacob's descendants over time will begin to multiply. They are in the land of Egypt, they and their descendants, for over 400 years, from about 1875 to 1445. 1875 to 1445, a total period of about 430 years. They are in the land of Egypt and they are multiplying. And you started out with just Jacob and his 12 sons and their wives and his grandchildren. But now, by the time more than 400 years has passed, they number in the millions. There are literally anywhere from 2, 3 to 4 million Jews now living in Egypt. Now, during that 400-year period, because they began to multiply so rapidly, the Egyptians were afraid that these foreigners living in their land might try to take over the land of Egypt and take charge of it. And so they made slaves of the Jewish people, so that they put them to work and they would never be able to own weapons or learn the art of warfare. And they thought that way they would never be able to take over the country of Egypt. And so they became slaves. Well, this then is when Moses comes on the scene. In the year 1445 BC, God sends Moses to the land of Egypt to rescue the Jewish people. Now, Moses originally had been born in Egypt. You may recall the story. He was adopted by one of the pharaohs of Egypt's daughter. A daughter of the pharaoh adopted Moses and raised her as her own son. So he was very well educated. But when he was 40 years old, he left the land of Egypt to live in a different place. And when he was 80 years old, God called him to go back to Egypt and deliver all of his fellow Jews out of slavery from Egypt. So he goes back to Egypt, he does the 10 plagues, and delivers his people out of Egypt. So they come out of Egypt in the year 1445 BC. Now, God's plan for this nation now of several million people, once they leave Egypt, they've got to live somewhere, right? So God's plan is to give them the land of Canaan. From the very beginning, God had promised Abraham that once his descendants became very numerous, he was going to give them that land of Canaan, and God would kick all the Canaanites out. They would go in and conquer it. So when Moses delivers the people from Egypt, he takes them to the land of Canaan, and he says, God is going to enable us to conquer the Canaanites there and give us their land. But the Jewish people at the time of Moses won't really trust the Lord. They don't have faith and confidence that God will give them military victory. And so they're afraid to go in and conquer the land. And so God says, fine, if you don't want the gift of the land, then you won't go in it. You'll just wander in the wilderness between Egypt and Canaan, just the wilderness. And you'll wander for 40 years until all of the adults die. And your children, anyone who was younger than 20 years old, they'll live, and after you all have died over the course of 40 years, they'll grow up in the meantime, and I'll give the land to them. And that's what happened. So after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, in the year 1405 BC, then that next generation, they trusted the Lord, and they went and conquered the land. Now Moses led the Jewish people for the 40 years in the wilderness, but at the end of the 40 years, Moses dies, and just before he dies, he passes the baton of leadership to a man named Joshua, and it is actually Joshua who will lead the Jewish people in the military battles to conquer the promised land, this land of Canaan. And it's called the promised land because God had promised Abraham that his descendants would have that land someday. So in the year 1405 BC, Joshua goes in and he conquers the land. Now, once the Jewish people had conquered the land of Canaan under the leadership of Joshua, the Jewish people divided up the land each descendant of one of those 12 sons of Jacob got a particular area of the land that would be assigned to them. Remember that these people were called tribes, and so we speak of the boundaries of the 12 tribes of Israel. So you're looking now on the screen at a map of the land and how it was divided up. You see the names of the different sons of Jacob and what portion of land that the various tribes inherited. So for example, down at the south, you see the area that was inherited by Judah and Simeon. More centrally located are the tribes of Benjamin, Dan, Ephraim, and West Manasseh. Farther to the north, you get the tribes of Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali. Now, you'll also observe that the land is divided by 2 seas and a river. To the north, the Sea of Galilee, and to the south, the Dead Sea. And running between the 2 seas, north to south, is a river called the Jordan River. And the Jews inherited some land on the other side of the river and those seas. Now again, to the south, you got the tribe of Reuben. Above that, the tribe of Gad. And then the tribe of Manasseh also had some land there. So Manasseh is divided into 2 parts, West Manasseh and East Manasseh. Now, that river that runs between the 2 seas and divides the land is a well-known river called the Jordan River. The Bible speaks frequently of that river. For example, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. I have been there to the land of Israel, and I've also had the privilege of baptizing people in that very river. So you're looking at a picture now on the screen of me actually baptizing people in the Jordan River. So that gives you a little sense of what that looked like and what it would have been like when Jesus was baptized. So this is how the land is divided up by the 12 tribes of Israel. Now then, for the next 355 years, or around then, after Joshua has died, the nation doesn't have any type of king to lead them. There are no kings, so you've got this nation in the land, and they've got laws that God has written for them, but they don't have a supreme leader over the land. There is no king. Instead, the only type of leadership that they have in the land are judges. Now, a judge is different than a king in 2 related ways. First of all, they're just raised up by God on an ad hoc basis. What that means is when there is some type of emergency, for example, enemies were attacking the nation and they needed somebody to lead them into battle to protect and preserve the nation. Normally that was the job of the king, to lead them into battle, but they had no king. So God would raise up some man and empower him by his Holy Spirit to lead the nation in battle. And once they had protected the people and conquered their enemies, that man had established his leadership and gained the respect of his fellow Jews. And so he would then, for the rest of his life, maintain a position of leadership over the nation. Once he died, his son did not follow him to a position of leadership. It was just as long as there was a need, God raised him up, he met that need, and for the rest of his life he stayed in leadership, and that's it. So this is different than a kingship, as I said, in 2 related ways. Number one, a judge did not inherit that position of leadership. He was raised up by God on an as-needed basis. And when they died, their children did not follow them to a position of leadership. So that's what a judge was. And so for a period of about 350 years, they had the judges. Now, probably the best-known judge was a man named Samson. You may remember Samson was the man that was endowed by God with supernatural strength. He wasn't naturally strong, but the power of God would overshadow him and come upon him as needed at certain times and just gave him this incredible strength. For example, there was a particular occasion when he was attacked by 1,000 men. So he was literally outnumbered 1,000 to 1. And he didn't even have any weapons. He simply had picked up a piece of bone on the ground. It was part of the jawbone of a donkey. And using that as his only weapon, he was able to defeat and slay 1,000 enemies that came against him. So that's how strong he was by the power of God. So Samson functions as a judge from this period of the judges. Now, after the 350 odd years of a period of judges, it came time for the people to have a king. God wanted to establish now a monarchy where they would have a line of kings. But the people got a little impatient and they ran ahead of God, and they chose a king that they wanted that really wasn't the man that God had in mind for the job, for the first king. They chose as king a man named Saul, and he ruled for 40 years from 1050 BC to 1010 BC. But he was not a real good king, and he did not provide good leadership for the nation. Well, while he was on the throne, God chose a young fella named David and began raising him to a position of national prominence. He begins to lead the nation in a lot of battles and has a lot of military expertise, and because of his military victories, he gains the respect of the people. And God is raising David up like that because David is the guy that God had in mind. David was God's choice. He was the chosen king. And so eventually Saul dies and David becomes the next king of Israel, but he's not a descendant of Saul. So Saul's dynasty was very short. His son doesn't follow him to the throne. Instead, God raises up David. And David also reigns for 40 years, from 1010 to 970 BC. Now, when David became king, God made a special deal with him. It's called a covenant. God entered into a covenant with David, just as he had with Abraham many years before. And he said, David, I've got plans for you. I'm going to do something special with you. He said, I brought you to the throne, and I've made you a king, and you're the beginning of a dynasty. That is, for many years, your descendants are going to follow you to the throne. In fact, not just for many years, but forever. Your dynasty will never end. There will always be a descendant of yours sitting upon the throne, ruling. Now, you would remember that this nation of Israel represented God's kingdom on earth. And so God is basically telling David, all right, this kingdom represents my kingdom, and it is your dynasty, you and your descendants, who will rule over my kingdom on earth forever. Now, eventually, some 1,000 years out into the future, Jesus Christ would be born. He would come into the world. And Jesus was a direct descendant of David, who was in line for David's throne. And when God promised David that his dynasty would last forever, basically what God had in mind was that eventually Jesus would be born. And when Jesus comes into this world, we talked about that, right? He's going to come back into the world again someday, and he's going to set up his throne in Jerusalem and rule the world from Jerusalem. Someday he'll create a whole new world, but he'll continue to rule the world, that new world, and he will do so as the king of the world, King Jesus. And he will do so as a direct descendant of David. So that when God promised David, David, I'm going to do something special for you. This is going to be the longest dynasty of kings ever, because it's literally going to last forever. That's what God meant. That someday Jesus would be born, and because Jesus lives forever, he will rule the world literally forever without end. David's dynasty would last forever. So David is a very important character in the Bible, because God uses him to set up this dynasty that will last forever through Jesus Christ. When David dies, his son follows him to the throne and reigns for 40 years, from the years 970 to 930 BC, and his name was Solomon. You may recall that Solomon was regarded as the wisest man in the history of the world. That is because when he was very young and his father died and he inherited the throne, he prayed to the Lord that God would give him wisdom. He said, God, I don't want money, I don't want wealth, I don't want power, I don't want prestige, I don't want fame. I just want the wisdom to lead your people and to represent your kingdom on earth well. And God was so pleased and honored with his prayer for wisdom that God gave him wisdom, so much so that he goes down as the wisest man in the history of the world. So these are the first three kings of the nation: King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. And their three reigns take us from 1050 BC down to 930 BC. That's a period of 120 years, each of them ruling for 40 years. When Solomon dies and his young son follows him to the throne, his son is a man named Rehoboam. But unfortunately, his son is not wise like he was. In fact, his son is very foolish, and he doesn't lead the nation well. In fact, he's so foolish that the people are so unhappy with his leadership that they rebel. And there is almost a civil war. Fortunately, it doesn't come to war, but the nation just decides to split into two separate kingdoms. And so 10 of the 12 tribes that live in the north split off from the rest of the nation, and so they are the northern kingdom. And then you have a couple tribes in the south. The primary tribe was called Judah, and that's where David's descendants continued to reign. And so it was the southern kingdom. So there was this split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And David's descendants continued to rule in the south. Now, the northern kingdom comes to be known by the name Israel. So up to that point, the whole nation was united. And so during the period of the first three kings, we call that the period of the united monarchy, meaning that Saul, David, and Solomon all reigned over the entire nation. But after that point, it is a divided kingdom, divided monarchies. So the northern kingdom takes the name Israel, but sometimes in the Old Testament it is also called Ephraim. It was called Ephraim because that was the largest tribe. They had the largest population. And so Israel or Ephraim are names for the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom, we said that it only consisted of two tribes, and the largest of that tribe was the tribe of Judah. So in the Old Testament, the southern tribe comes to be known as Judah. Now, the northern kingdom lasts from the year 930 BC until the year 722 BC, a little over 200 years. You have various kings and dynasties that rule over that northern kingdom. But these people are very wicked. They really won't follow the law of Moses at all, and God gives them chance time and again, but they won't follow the law of Moses. So in the year 722 BC, God allows the Assyrian kingdom, which has become a very powerful nation in the world, it becomes an empire. And so God allows the Assyrian people to come and attack that northern kingdom of Israel, or Ephraim, and they destroy the kingdom. They conquer the capital city, which was a city called Samaria. And they send all these Jewish people out of their homeland and send them into dispersion around other countries all around the world. And to this day, nobody knows where all those people eventually ended up. They just got scattered around the world. So God kicked them out of the promised land because they wouldn't obey the law of Moses. And for literally thousands of years, they were just gone. They never came back home to the promised land. Now, down in the south, where the descendants of King David were reigning, they were a little more fortunate. That kingdom lasted longer. It lasted from 930 BC, when the two kingdoms split off. It lasted from 930 BC down to the year 586 BC, always with descendants of David ruling it. But like the northern kingdom, the people of the southern kingdom also did not follow the law of Moses. They wouldn't keep the law of Moses either. And so in the year 586 BC, God allowed the Babylonians to come and conquer the southern kingdom. The Babylonians destroyed the city of Jerusalem, they burned the temple to the ground, and they took many of the Jewish people off into captivity in the land of Babylon. That happened in 586 BC. Among some of the better known Jews who were carried off into captivity into the land of Babylon would be Daniel. The story of Daniel is in the book of Daniel in the Bible, or the prophet Ezekiel, who writes a book in the Bible. And so they're brought off into captivity. And the Jewish people are there in captivity from this southern kingdom of Judah from the years 586 BC to 538 BC in captivity. So we simply refer to this period in history as the period of the Babylonian exile, meaning they've been exiled or kicked out of their own land and living as captives in the foreign land of Babylon. But in the year 538 BC, God was very gracious to these Jewish people, and that he allowed the Persian Empire to come to power. The Persians conquered the Babylonians. They became the next major world empire. And when the Persians became the major leading power in the world, they were kind to the Jewish people, and they told the Jews they could go back to their homeland in the land of Judah, right, in the Holy Land. They could go back home. And so in 538 BC, the Jews began making preparations. Many of them who had been living in Babylon go back to the homeland of Judah. And by the year 516 BC, they have rebuilt the temple. In the year 444 BC, they rebuild the city of Jerusalem with the help of a man named Nehemiah. He provides the leadership and gets the city built. So they are now back in their homeland. They have the city and they have the temple. But they no longer have a king. The last king to rule as a descendant of David over the nation was in the year 586 BC. When the Babylonians destroyed the nation, they lost national sovereignty. They were captive to the Babylonians. Now the Persians have allowed them to go back home and rebuild the city and the temple, but they are still under the dominion of the Persian Empire, so they cannot have a king sitting on the throne. They cannot have their independence as a sovereign nation. They're home, but they're not a free nation, not a sovereign nation. And so there is no descendant of David now sitting on the throne and ruling. It's not long after this that a prophet named Malachi writes the last book of the Old Testament. That's around the year 425 BC. Malachi writes his book, and that is the last book in the Old Testament. And then that's it. At that point, God no longer raises up any prophets to bring his word to people. They have a lot of scripture that have already been written by prophets in years prior to this, and so there are no longer any more prophets writing scripture. So the last book of the Bible in 425 BC. Now, again, as you would know, then it's going to be some 400-something years later that Jesus will be born. And this time period, from the time that Malachi wrote the last book of the Old Testament until the birth of Jesus, and Jesus comes on the world scene and he begins his earthly ministry, that is often referred to by historians as the 400 silent years. 400 silent years. It's called silent because it's a time period where God is no longer speaking through any prophets, no scriptures being written. Until Jesus comes on the scene, and now, of course, you've got the ministry of John the Baptist as a prophet, and of course you've got Jesus himself revealing God and his word to us, and so God breaks his silence with the birth of Jesus. And again, remember that Jesus is a direct descendant of David who was destined to come back to the world someday and rule the world, and he will do so in his capacity as a descendant of David. So for the last 2,500 years, since the year 538 BC, no descendant of David has been sitting on his throne. No descendant of his has been ruling. But Jesus will come someday, and when he does, he will rule and reign. And that will be the fulfillment of God's promise to David, that his dynasty will last forever. So David does have an heir to his throne who yet lives. It's just that his heir is now living in heaven. And when he comes to earth, he'll take his place on the throne in Jerusalem. So that's just a quick run through of some of the key events and characters from the Old Testament, putting them in chronological sequence, and I hope that helps a little bit to kind of know who some of these key characters were and when they live in relationship to one another and where they fit within the larger story of the Bible.